On June 5, 2002, a 14-year-old girl was taken at knife point from her bedroom in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her 9-month captivity would become one of America's most watched missing persons cases. But as Netflix prepares to release their documentary on January 21, 2026, there are shocking details about the Elizabeth Smart case that have been buried, overlooked, or deliberately hidden from the public eye. This is the story they won't tell you. If you're interested in cold cases, unsolved mysteries, and the truth behind famous crimes, subscribe to Criminal Minds Archive and hit that notification bell. We dig deeper than the headlines to bring you the full story. Elizabeth Smart was supposed to graduate from middle school in just days. Instead, she woke up to cold steel pressed against her throat and a voice commanding her to get up. The man who had entered through a cut kitchen window screen was Brian David Mitchell, a drifter who called himself Emmanuel and claimed to be a prophet of God. Her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine, was in the same bedroom. She heard the intruder's voice but froze in terror, pretending to sleep as she watched a bearded man lead Elizabeth down the hallway. What most documentaries gloss over is the psychological torture that began immediately. Mary Catherine lay paralyzed with fear for 2 full hours before finally mustering the courage to wake her parents. By then, Elizabeth was already 4 miles away, being forced to hike through the woods in her nightgown. But here's what the documentaries won't tell you. Mitchell didn't choose Elizabeth randomly. He had been watching her for months. In November 2001, 7 months before the kidnapping, Elizabeth's mother had given Mitchell $5 while he was panhandling in downtown Salt Lake City. She offered him additional money if he'd do some work on their roof. Mitchell, clean-shaven at the time, accepted and worked at the Smart home for a single day. During those hours, he studied the house layout, observed the family's routines, and most disturbingly, he fixated on Elizabeth. Elizabeth later wrote in her memoir that she didn't know at the time, but Mitchell had been watching me very carefully and had taken the opportunity to study me further during that brief encounter. When Mitchell returned on that June night, now with a full beard that made him nearly unrecognizable, he knew exactly which window to cut, which room Elizabeth slept in, and how to navigate the house in darkness. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. It was a meticulously planned abduction by a predator who had been stalking his victim for months. To understand this case, you need to understand the disturbing dynamic between Brian David Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee. This wasn't a case of one monster and his reluctant accomplice. This was a partnership built on shared delusions, extreme religious manipulation, and mutual abuse. Mitchell and Barzee met in 1985 at a divorce therapy group. Both were coming out of failed marriages. Barzee had 6 children from her previous marriage, and her relationship with them was deeply troubled. One of her daughters later called her a monster and made the horrifying claim that Barzee had once fed her pet rabbit to her for dinner. Their relationship was toxic from the start. During Mitchell's trial, Barzee testified that their first year of marriage was hellish, and that Mitchell was possessive and controlling. She described him as consumed by fear and doubt, prone to angry outbursts where he would leave the house before he got so violent that he would hurt somebody or destroy something. But here's the disturbing truth documentaries often miss. Barzee wasn't just a victim of Mitchell's control. She was an active, willing participant in Elizabeth's captivity and abuse. A Mormon bishop told Barzee that Satan was going to do everything in his power to stop their relationship. Rather than seeing the red flags, Barzee used this as justification. She testified that she learned to be submissive and obedient to Mitchell. Together they descended into increasingly extreme religious beliefs. Mitchell began calling himself Emmanuel David Isaiah, claiming to be a prophet who received direct revelations from God. He wrote his own religious manuscript, the Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah, which mixed Mormon theology with his own twisted revelations that conveniently justified polygamy and taking young girls as wives. Barzee took the name Hepzibah Elada Isaiah and fully embraced Mitchell's delusions. They were excommunicated from the Mormon Church in June 2002 for their extreme views. By that point, they had already kidnapped Elizabeth. When Mitchell dragged Elizabeth to their mountain camp that first night, it was Barzee who performed the ritualistic foot washing, a biblical tradition Mitchell twisted into a preparation for what he called a marriage ceremony. When Elizabeth refused to change out of her pajamas into the robe Barzee provided, Barzee threatened to have Mitchell come rip my pajamas off. Elizabeth later testified that Barzee wasn't just present during the assaults. She enabled them, participated in the psychological torture, and even became jealous of Mitchell's obsessive attention to their captive. Mitchell eventually established a rotation system where he would alternate between Barzee and Elizabeth to manage Barzee's jealousy. According to Elizabeth's testimony, Barzee would complain, "All you do is lust after her." This wasn't a woman trying to protect Elizabeth. This was a woman angry that her husband preferred raping a 14-year-old girl over spending time with her. One of the most haunting aspects of Elizabeth's captivity is how many times she was nearly rescued, how many people saw her, and how close she came to freedom before it slipped away. For the first few weeks, Mitchell kept Elizabeth chained to a tree at their mountain campsite, just 4 miles from her home. She could sometimes hear her uncle calling her name during search efforts, but she was too terrified to respond. Mitchell had made it clear, if she tried to escape or alert anyone, he would kill her and her entire family.
And I remember hearing my name being called very distinctly, and I remember thinking it sounded just like my uncle. He grabbed me and he said, "I will kill you if you make a noise. I will kill whoever comes up here to find you. If they ever get into this camp, I will kill them."
But then Mitchell made a calculated decision. Rather than hide Elizabeth away, he would hide her in plain sight. Dressed in identical white robes with veils covering their faces, Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth began making regular trips into Salt Lake City. They attended parties, ate at restaurants, visited libraries, and stayed in strangers' homes. Elizabeth, her face covered by a veil and under constant threats, walked past her own missing person posters while volunteers searched frantically for her. During one trip to downtown Salt Lake City, they attended a rave-style party where Elizabeth testified there was a lot of drinking and drugs, and she could smell marijuana burning. When a grocery store employee tried to talk to Elizabeth, Mitchell aggressively intervened, stating, "This is my daughter, and she can't talk to you." But the most agonizing near miss came in August 2002 at the Salt Lake City Public Library. A library patron noticed 3 people dressed in full-length robes with veils, an unusual sight even in Salt Lake City. Something about the young woman's eyes troubled the patron enough to call police. They said they thought they recognized Elizabeth Smart. Detective John Ricci was dispatched to investigate. What happened next remains one of the most controversial moments in the entire case. Elizabeth was sitting at a library table with Barzee when the detective approached. Mitchell had momentarily stepped away. This was Elizabeth's chance, perhaps her only chance to be rescued. He said he was looking for Elizabeth Smart, Elizabeth later testified. Under the table, Barzee squeezed her leg hard, a warning to stay silent. Detective Ricci asked if he could look under her veil. It was a reasonable request. Elizabeth Smart's face was on every news station, every newspaper, every poster in the city. All he needed was one quick look to either confirm or rule her out. But when Mitchell returned, he positioned himself between the detective and Elizabeth. In a calm, controlled voice, Mitchell explained that removing the veil violated their religious beliefs. Only a woman's husband, he claimed, should ever see her face. Ricci pressed. He asked if he could become part of their religion for just one day, so he could lift the veil and report back that it wasn't Elizabeth Smart. Mitchell stood firm. His demeanor remained calm and reasonable. He never raised his voice or showed any signs of nervousness. And Detective Ricci walked away. Years later, during Mitchell's trial, Ricci testified about that moment. He said he was concerned about violating the young woman's civil rights if Mitchell's religious claim was legitimate. He added that Mitchell's calm demeanor didn't set off any alarms. Mitchell claimed the girl was an 18-year-old relative, and Ricci testified she appeared tall enough to be 18. When Ricci learned months later that the veiled girl had been Elizabeth Smart all along, he said it left him traumatized. He told reporters, "I don't see anything else I could have done." But many disagree. This was a high-profile missing child case. The detective had received a tip specifically about Elizabeth Smart, and yet he allowed religious claims from a stranger to prevent him from conducting a basic identification check. Elizabeth's own testimony reveals her devastation at that moment. "I felt like hope was walking out the door. I was so mad at myself for not taking the chance. I felt like it was so close. I felt terrible that the detective could just walk away." After that close call, Mitchell forced Elizabeth to wear an additional veil over her eyes because, he told her, "The world wasn't ready for that light in my eyes." Within weeks, fearing another encounter with police, Mitchell decided they needed to leave Utah entirely. The library encounter wasn't the only failure in Elizabeth's case. In fact, the Salt Lake City Police Department's handling of the investigation was so problematic that it nearly cost Elizabeth her life. From the beginning, police fixated on the wrong suspect, Richard Ricci, a handyman with a lengthy criminal record who had also worked at the smart home. Ricci had a history of burglary and drug abuse. He fit the profile investigators wanted. He became their prime suspect, despite having an alibi and consistently denying any involvement. Ricci was arrested on unrelated parole violations and charged with stealing jewelry from the smart home. The media, fed by police leaks, ran with the story. Richard Ricci was plastered across newspapers and television as the prime suspect in Elizabeth Smart's kidnapping. But there was a problem. Ricci was innocent. In August 2002, while still in custody, Ricci suffered a brain hemorrhage. He collapsed in his cell and fell into a coma. 3 days later, his family made the decision to remove him from life support. Richard Ricci died on August 30th, 2002, without ever being formally charged in Elizabeth's disappearance. Even after Ricci's death, police continued to focus on him as their primary lead. They told the media that while they couldn't definitively rule him out, his death was a major blow to the investigation. Meanwhile, the real kidnapper was traveling freely with Elizabeth, moving between Salt Lake City and California. Here's what the documentaries often leave out. Mary Catherine Smart, Elizabeth's 9-year-old sister and the only witness to the kidnapping, had recognized the kidnapper's voice months earlier. In October 2002, 4 months into Elizabeth's captivity, Mary Catherine told her parents she believed the kidnapper might be the man they knew as Emmanuel, the homeless preacher who had worked on their roof for one day. She remembered his voice. She remembered his calm, soft-spoken manner. The Smart family immediately brought this information to police.
Okay, you said you met him on the street. Do you know what street that was?
The downtown is in that area, you know, where a lot of homeless people go.
And when was the next time that you saw this man?
Oh, he came up to our house. We came in the front door, and I know he saw me, or we was going to our room.
Was Emmanuel the man who was in your bedroom?
I'm not quite sure, it might have been.
You're not quite sure, but it might have been?
They pleaded with investigators to focus on Mitchell and to publicize his photograph. Police dismissed it. They were convinced Richard Ricci was their man, even though he was dead. When the Smart family pressed the issue, police told them there wasn't much to this Emmanuel guy and that the family might be concocting this story to get Elizabeth back into the news. Chris Thomas, the Smart family's communications manager, later revealed that a national media producer told him, "You might want to sit down. This is going to upset you. The police department is saying that you are concocting this story." For 5 agonizing months, the Smart family debated what to do. Police were actively discouraging them from pursuing the Mitchell lead. But Elizabeth's parents couldn't shake the feeling that Mary Catherine was right. Finally, on February 3rd, 2003, the Smart family defied police and held their own press conference. They released a sketch of Mitchell based on Mary Catherine's description. They went public with the name Emmanuel. Within days, Mitchell's family saw the sketch on television and contacted authorities with his real name, Brian David Mitchell. Just over a month later, on March 12, 2003, Mitchell was recognized on the street in Sandy, Utah, by multiple witnesses who had seen his photo on America's Most Wanted. Police were called, and Elizabeth was finally rescued. Chris Thomas later said, "Elizabeth may never have been found. Isn't that mind-blowing to you? If they hadn't done that, it's not out of the question that she's still out there somewhere." After Elizabeth's rescue, Police Chief Rick Dentz admitted, Hindsight is 20 vision. If we had to go back over it again, I think every one of our investigators would say, I wish we had gone public with that earlier. But those admissions came too late for Richard Ricci, whose reputation was destroyed, or for Elizabeth, who endured 5 additional months of captivity because police refused to listen to a 9-year-old girl who remembered her attacker's voice. When police finally approached Mitchell on that March day in Sandy, they found him walking with 2 women dressed in robes and veils. One of them was wearing a gray wig, sunglasses, and multiple layers of concealment. Officers separated the 3 and began questioning the young woman. "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" they asked. "No," she replied. "My name is Augustine Marshall." Even after being separated from Mitchell and Barzee, even with police officers directly asking if she was the missing girl, Elizabeth continued to lie. She had been so thoroughly terrorized, so completely psychologically manipulated over 9 months, that she couldn't immediately break free from Mitchell's control. The officers persisted. They told her that her parents missed her, that they were worried about her. Finally, Elizabeth broke down and admitted the truth. She was Elizabeth Smart.
I noticed 3 individuals on the sidewalk, and I said to my husband, look at the way these people are dressed because they really look different, with their clothing. When they got approximately right here at the driveway, I turned and looked, and he turned and looked at me right in the face. I knew it was him once I saw the face because it was the same expression I had seen on the pictures on the television. I walked around the front of the car to the passenger side, and I told my husband, I said, give me your cell phone, that's him, I'm calling the police.
When I got out of my car, I stopped them, asked them if they would stop and talk to me. I had some questions for them. I asked them what their names were. They gave me Peter Marshall, Juliet Marshall, and Augustine Marshall.
But this girl standing off to the side really stood out to me because she had this disguise on. It just didn't fit.
She was wearing a wig, a gray-haired wig, claiming that she was 17 or 18. She was the only one out of 3 wearing some sort of disguise. So once we kind of keyed into, well, she does kind of look like Elizabeth Smart.
She then said something like, I think you know who I think I am, but I'm not that person. And I said, well, who do you think we think you are? And she says, you think I'm that Elizabeth Smart girl? She says, well, I'm not that girl. I held up the poster right next to her face and said, Elizabeth, this is you. She says, no, that's not me.
At one point I could see her t-shirt actually moving. Her heart was pounding very fast in her chest.
Her eyes welled up with tears. You could tell she wanted just to physically say it, but she wouldn't. And I says, Elizabeth, just for your peace of mind and your family's, tell me that you're Elizabeth Smart. And she says, thou say it then. And I said, excuse me? She says, thou say it. I've never heard that before. It's a biblical phrase. And I says, well, I'll take that as a yes then.
Peter and Juliet were placed into 2 separate cars. She immediately started crying once she got into the back of my car. And her first question was, what's going to happen to them? She was very concerned over their welfare, what was going to happen to them, what we were going to do to them.
She was handcuffed per standard procedure and driven to the police station. I was very scared, she later testified. I knew the threats that I had been told for 9 months. I didn't know why I was being handcuffed. I thought maybe I had done something wrong, that I was guilty. At the station, alone in a small room, Elizabeth finally removed the wig and sunglasses. Her father, Ed Smart, was called to the station. He had been told he needed to identify a possible suspect. When he walked in and saw Elizabeth, he was stunned. The news spread instantly. Elizabeth Smart was alive. After 9 months, 16,000 tips, and one of the largest searches in Utah history, the 14-year-old girl had been found. What Elizabeth endured during those 9 months was even more horrific than most people know. On that first night, after forcing Elizabeth to walk 4 miles into the mountains in her nightgown, Mitchell performed what he called a marriage ceremony. Barzee washed Elizabeth's feet and forced her to change into robes. Then Mitchell raped her. He would continue to rape her by her own testimony every day for the next 9 months.
Pull myself together just enough to hear him say that I was now his wife. I remember thinking, I know what comes after a wedding. And that cannot happen to me. That cannot happen. Fighting the whole way, and he raped me right there on the floor of the tent. And then when he was finished, he stood up, and I was left alone, feeling absolutely broken, absolutely shattered. I was broken beyond repair.
You were worthless.
I was going to be thrown away. I remember lying there and just thinking of the children whom I had seen on the news, who only their bodies had been found, and I remember thinking, wow, they are the lucky ones. They will never have to feel this pain ever again. They're in heaven right now, and I wish I could be there.
You wanted to die?
Yes.
There wasn't an actual 24-hour period he wasn't able to rape me, Elizabeth testified during Mitchell's trial.
You write, and this is a quote from your book, over the next 9 months, Brian David Mitchell would rape me every day, sometimes multiple times a day. He would torture and brutalize me in ways that are impossible to imagine, starve and manipulate me like I was an animal.
Every time I thought, okay, this cannot get worse, it always did.
Mitchell forced Elizabeth to consume alcohol and view pornography. He chained her to trees, sometimes hiding her in holes in the ground when he thought searchers might be nearby. She was starved, threatened daily with death, and psychologically manipulated into believing that even if she escaped, she was now worthless because she was no longer a virgin. This aspect of the case reveals one of the most insidious effects of Mitchell's abuse. Elizabeth later spoke publicly about how her Mormon upbringing, which emphasized chastity and purity, made her feel that the sexual abuse had destroyed her worth as a person. Because if people ever find out what happened to me, nobody is going to want to interact with me. Nobody's going to want to sully themselves by being by me, she remembered thinking. Mitchell exploited this belief system to maintain psychological control, even when physical restraints weren't possible. He told her that God wanted this to happen to her, that she should be thankful for being chosen. He claimed he was a prophet, that he would one day emerge in 7 years, be stoned by a mob, lie dead in the streets for 3 days, and then rise up and kill the Antichrist. When Mitchell and Barzee took Elizabeth into public, dressed in identical robes with her face veiled, she encountered multiple opportunities to escape or seek help. People spoke to them. They attended parties. They stayed in strangers' homes. Mitchell even got arrested once in California for breaking into a church and spent a week in jail, leaving Elizabeth alone with Barzee at their campsite where they nearly starved. But Elizabeth never tried to run. The psychological prison Mitchell had constructed was as effective as any physical chains. There's one detail that stands out as particularly chilling. Mitchell once attempted to kidnap Elizabeth's 15-year-old cousin, Jessica Wright, just weeks after taking Elizabeth. On July 24, 2002, Mitchell tried to break into the Wright home by cutting through a bedroom window screen, the exact same method he had used to enter the smart home. Jessica woke up to the sound and Mitchell fled, but his intent was clear. He was planning to take a second wife.
All of a sudden he turned to me and he said, I've had a revelation that Olivia, your cousin, is supposed to be my next wife. I felt like such a terrible person. I had just betrayed one of my very best friends.
You had just put her life in
I
real
just
danger.
more or less put her name on her own death warrant, because if she was successfully kidnapped, her life would be over the same way mine was.
On the time, officers said the incident likely had no connection to Elizabeth's kidnapping.
But really, there was. And there was intent to do the same thing to my cousin Olivia that had been done to me.
Mitchell also attempted to kidnap another young girl while they were in California. Elizabeth wrote about this in her memoir, though details remain limited. After their arrest in March 2003, both Mitchell and Barzee were charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and burglary. But what should have been a straightforward prosecution turned into a years-long legal nightmare. Mitchell immediately began claiming he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. During court appearances, he would sing hymns, shout religious condemnations, and behave erratically. In 2005, a state judge ruled Mitchell incompetent and sent him to Utah State Hospital. But prosecutors and investigators believed Mitchell was manipulating the system. FBI Special Agent Jeff Ross, who interrogated Mitchell after his arrest, later said, "He was incredibly controlled. He knew exactly what he was doing when he was manipulating the entire situation. Because if he were truly mentally ill and incompetent to stand trial, he would have lost it during that interview." The debate raged. Was Mitchell genuinely delusional, or was he a shrewd manipulator using mental illness as a defense? In 2006, Utah passed a bill allowing prosecutors to forcibly medicate defendants to restore their competence for trial. Barzee was medicated first. In 2009, she pleaded guilty to state and federal charges. In a tearful statement, she apologized to Elizabeth. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, for all the pain and suffering I caused you and your family. It is my hope you will be able to find it in your heart and forgive me." She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. With credit for time served, she was released in September 2018, much to Elizabeth's dismay. Mitchell's case took longer. Finally, in March 2010, after years of disruption and bizarre courtroom behavior, a judge ruled him competent to stand trial. The ruling came down hard. The evidence proves that Mitchell has the capacity to assist his counsel in his defense and the ability to behave appropriately in the courtroom. Mitchell's trial began in November 2010. Elizabeth, now 23 years old and recently returned from serving as a Mormon missionary in Paris, took the witness stand for 3 days of testimony. She calmly, methodically detailed the sexual abuse, the psychological torture, and the horrific conditions she endured. When Mitchell's defense attorney attempted to claim his client was insane, Elizabeth shut it down. 9 months of living with him and seeing him proclaim that he was God's servant and called to do God's work. "Everything he did to me and my family is something that I know that God would not tell somebody to do. God would never tell someone to kidnap her at knifepoint." The jury deliberated for 5 hours before finding Mitchell guilty of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines for sexual activity. Elizabeth was seen smiling and exchanging glances with her mother when the verdict was announced. During sentencing, Elizabeth confronted her abductor one final time. "I know that you know what you did was wrong. You took away 9 months of my life that can never be returned. But in this life or next, you will have to be held responsible for those actions. And I hope you are ready for when that time comes." Brian David Mitchell was sentenced to 2 life terms without possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, a high-security federal prison. He will die there. Elizabeth Smart's story didn't end with her rescue or Mitchell's conviction. In many ways, it was just beginning. In the years following her ordeal, Elizabeth became one of the most prominent advocates for child safety and sexual assault prevention in the United States. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation to combat sexual violence and raise awareness about abductions. She has spoken publicly about the harmful effects of abstinence-only education, particularly how it made her feel worthless after being raped. She has testified before Congress multiple times to support sexual predator legislation and the Amber Alert system. In 2012, she married Matthew Gilmore, whom she met while they were both serving Mormon missions in Paris. They now have children and live in Utah. But Elizabeth has also been remarkably candid about the long-term psychological impact of her captivity. She has spoken about the difficulty of moving forward, the importance of therapy, and the reality that trauma doesn't simply disappear because the perpetrator is in prison. In 2013, she published her memoir, My Story, co-written with Chris Stewart. In 2018, she released Where There's Hope, Healing, Moving Forward, and Never Giving Up. She has produced multiple Lifetime films about abduction survivors, including I Am Elizabeth Smart in 2017, which told her story from her own perspective on the 15th anniversary of her kidnapping. Today, Elizabeth works as a commentator for ABC News and continues to advocate for missing persons and assault survivors. She has transformed her trauma into a mission to protect others and give voice to victims who feel voiceless. Elizabeth Smart's case changed how law enforcement handles child abductions, led to reforms in how police communicate with families of missing children, and sparked conversations about the psychological manipulation tactics predators use to control their victims. If this deep dive into the Elizabeth Smart case has opened your eyes to details you never knew, make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Minds Archive. We bring you the untold stories, the hidden details, and the full truth behind the cases that captivate the nation. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into cold cases, famous crimes, and the stories the mainstream media won't fully tell. The Netflix documentary releasing on January 21st will tell Elizabeth's story in her own words, and that's important. Her voice matters. Her perspective matters. But what you've heard today are the details that documentaries often sanitize or skip entirely. The months of stalking before the abduction, the active role Barzee played in Elizabeth's torture, the multiple police failures that extended her captivity by months, the library encounter that could have ended her nightmare 7 months early, and the investigation so flawed that police accused the family of fabricating evidence while the real kidnapper walked free. Elizabeth Smart survived not because the system worked, but in spite of how badly it failed her. She survived because of a 9-year-old girl who trusted her memory, parents who refused to give up, and witnesses who recognized a face from America's Most Wanted. Her resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma, her willingness to speak publicly about the most horrific experience of her life, and her determination to turn her suffering into advocacy for others. That is the real story of Elizabeth Smart. And now you know the full truth. If you or someone you know has been affected by abduction or sexual assault, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1-800-THE-LOST, and RAIN, 1-800-656-HOPE, provide resources and support.